Hello and welcome to our television program, Why We Are Christians. My name is Kent Philpott. I'm pastor of Miller Avenue Baptist Church in Mill Valley, California. Now, our guest on the program is down in Palmdale, California, and his name is Ken Hart. Welcome, Ken, to the program.
Very happy to be here. Thank you.
All right. And, well, you've got quite a story here, and we're going to try to put it all together, Ken. And now, where are you at right now? You're at a church, aren't you?
Right. We're at the church we founded 34 years ago.
Wow. What's the name of the church?
It's called the Highlands.
The Highlands. And it's there in Palmdale.
That's right.
And you're there, it looks like, in either a library or the pastor's office.
I am in our church library.
Oh, you're in the church library. Okay, Ken.
Yep.
I know you were born in Blythe, California. Where's Blythe?
Oh my, it's out in the desert near the Colorado River, out in the middle of nowhere, really.
It's okay. Yeah, all right, very good. Well, tell us about your family. What was going on with your parents? You have brothers and sisters?
Well, Kent, growing up, we were born into a very difficult situation. My father abandoned us before I can even remember. My mother ended up having 9 children, and she gave 3 of them away. And when a stepfather came into our life, who was just absolutely brutal, molesting my sisters and beating us up. And so very disturbed, very troubling childhood. I went into high school, was kicked out of high school in my freshman year for drugs. I was put in a continuation high school, and I was kicked out of there 2 times in my sophomore year and told never to come back. They stamped my papers incorrigible and told me to hit the road. And my mother couldn't handle me anymore. So at the age of 16, I was on my own and out just running wild, going up to San Francisco, Haight-Ashbury district, just living a very wild life. 1965 is when I first began to get in some serious trouble. I was being arrested and I was just kind of on a track to become a very troubled young person, very wild and rebellious, and sort of identified with the hippie movement that was happening at that time, and became, addicted to meth and different drugs, taking LSD, smoking marijuana all the time.
Wow, Ken. So you were traveling up to the Haight-Ashbury. About what year were you coming up then?
I was going up to Haight-Ashbury in 67, 68.
Okay.
66 probably the first time.
Well,
End of 66.
Yeah, I started going to the Haight-Ashbury in February of 1967. 1967, the first Thursday in February of 67 was my first visit to the Haight-Ashbury, yeah, and started doing the ministry there. In your upbringing, did you go to any kind of church, any kind of religious background at all?
No, really didn't have any of that in our lives. Didn't really know much about church. I just sort of had an opinion that it was a religion and that they probably were hypocrites and, really didn't know God, but lived by rules that I certainly wasn't willing to live by.
Now, Billy Graham was a major figure in that area. Did you ever hear about Billy Graham?
Not before coming to Christ. No, I really didn't have any awareness of church people.
Okay. How did you survive, Ken, on the street? How did you make it?
We did a lot of hitchhiking. We'd make friends. I had friends in our local town that would take me in, and I went from couch to couch to couch, and many times I slept at, I didn't even understand the whole concept of being homeless, but we were often homeless, sleeping wherever we could find a place to sleep, and we just went from flop house to flop house. I had a lot of friends, so I could always find some place to sleep.
Wow. What a story, Ken. I'm surprised that you've survived those years.
Yeah, I really am surprised. I've often said that I think if God hadn't had a plan for my life, I may not have survived that. I've been in some very dangerous situations. I had drug dealers that wanted to kill me, and so that was yeah, a lot of close calls. A lot of close
A
calls.
lot of close calls, Ken. Okay. Um, so how was it that you even started hearing about what Christianity was? What happened? How'd that start?
Well, we had just returned from the Haight, and I was at a party with some friends, and there came a knock on the door, um, and I heard somebody say, "Is Kenny Hart here?" And they said, "Yeah, he's here. Why?" And so they let these guys in, and I knew one was Greg Van Proyn, who had been a very respected heavyweight in the hippie scene, and another man by the name of David Hoyt.
Now, where was
And
this?
I know that you know David well.
Now, Ken, what town was this?
This was in Lancaster.
No, oh, this is in Lancaster. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Well,
I just
David.
returned from the Haight-Ashbury and was there seeing some friends. And I was at a party. We were getting high, and in came these guys, and I knew them, and I could just see a difference in their whole countenance was different than what I remembered. They had been very dark figures, and now they are very bright and filled with love. They were smiling, and I scooted up against the wall because I was so intimidated by what I was seeing. And they began to look right at me and share with me. And I'm thinking, man, you don't know what I've done. You don't know the stuff I've been involved in. There's no way, if there's a God, there is no way he could forgive me. And this man, Greg Van Proyn, said, "I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that God can't forgive you." And I thought, oh my goodness, he's reading my mind. He has the power to read my mind. And so I just closed my eyes as they were telling us that we could receive Christ as our Savior. And Kent, I closed my eyes, and it was though I could see the face of Jesus, and he had his hands reaching out toward me in a very loving way. And I don't know if it was actually Jesus, but he let me have a picture of this loving, the same kind of brightness and joy that was being expressed in these men that were sharing with me. And tears started flowing down my eyes. I thought that was like 30 minutes I was in that time, but later they told me it was about 30 seconds. When I opened my eyes, I had some drugs in my pocket, and I had some cigarettes, and I took them out, and I gave them to the young man next to me, a friend of mine. I said, "Here, do you want these?" And he said, "Sure." And he took them, and they said to me, "You just received Christ as your Savior, didn't you?" And I said, "Yeah, I think I did." And so then they prayed a sinner's prayer with me. And I just, in that moment, I can't even express to you the joy that just flooded over me. And it was like there was this dirty person. And from the bottom of my feet all the way to the top of my head, I just felt this cleansing happening inside of me and this relief. And for the first time in my life, I felt peace and I felt love. And I knew my life would be different. I didn't need the drugs anymore. I was smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day because I was taking meth, and I just knew I didn't need any of that anymore. And from that moment on, it's just all been about Jesus.
Now, Ken, this has to have been 1968. And David Hoyt, I met him in that first Thursday in February. I met David Hoyt. He was the leading, I don't know what you call him, but the Hare Krishna temple on Frederick, right next to Kezar Stadium, right there in the Haight. And I started a Bible study in the temple with permission of Swami Bhaktivedanta. And David became a Christian. He called me up. He moved into our house and lived with us for a time. And then he would leave. And eventually he went down to Lancaster. And that's where he met you.
Well, David was one of, I think, the top 5 most influential and powerful men on the street in Haight-Ashbury. in that time.
Oh, yeah.
And so really to have him, they told me later that they had got together and they prayed, Lord, who would you want us now to go and tell about the Lord? And the Lord put me on their heart. So they went out searching for me. And when they found out I was at this party that was happening in Lancaster, they came and knocked on the door there. And everybody was very impressed, because these are guys that were highly respected individuals. And so they came in and just began to share the love of God. And first time I'd ever heard anything like that in my life. Now, and it just changed me radically.
Now, when down in Lancaster, David started a thing called the Way In. It was a former treatment place for people with tuberculosis.
Actually, back up. I went over, when I got saved, I went over to some friend's house. They were living in kind of a drug communal home, and I began to tell them what had happened to me. And they were smoking grass, and so I started to get high. And so I left there because I didn't want to get high. And the next day they came and found me, and I told them what had happened, that David had shared with me and Greg, and I had received Christ, and then I invited them over to a Bible study that was actually happening with the former largest heroin dealer in the Antelope Valley, which is the valley we live in. Bob Duell was his name. I ended up getting baptized with him, and Bob had a Bible study at his house, and these kids came over, these young people, they got saved, this group. And so the house there became, and David, of course, lived there in the house as well. That became a home for people that were getting saved to come to. And then shortly after that, we had an opportunity, the doors opened for us to go to that ranch that used to be formerly a tuberculosis center. And we headquartered there for a while.
Well, I have to hold this up, Ken. This is the jacket. This is a jacket that David Hoyt gave me. He called me up and wanted me to come down. And my former wife, Bobby, and I went down to Lancaster, and we stayed there at the Way In. And David gave me this coat, and this is what I wore, my coat in the Haight-Ashbury for years, doing street ministry. And so this is it. I took it. I remember I had it and I found it. But those were the days, Ken. And I would like to say it was the time of the Jesus People movement.
Yes.
That went from about 1967. Some people say 1972. Some say up to 1975. This morning I got an email saying, in some places it went to 1977. So this was one of the 4 great awakenings in America.
But you know what, Kent? When you think about it, many of those young people, those hippies that were getting saved in that day, have gone on to have significant ministry. So really, the influence of that moment continues to this very day. I'm a product of the Jesus People movement, and pastored now for years and raised up a church from scratch, from no people to a church of thousands of people here in the Antelope Valley. And that all happened because of what began there in Haight-Ashbury with people like yourself. That was the flashpoint.
Yes.
People attribute the beginning to being Calvary Chapel with Chuck Smith down in Southern California, but really it all started. Lonnie Frisbee, of course, was living there in the Haight district. And I think he was going to a house called the House of Acts.
That's right.
If I'm not mistaken. And then he would come over to the Clayton House, I stayed in the Clayton House for a while. And he would come over there and he would ask Dick Key, who was the head of that group, and Greg Van Proyn, he would say, can I still smoke grass? Can I still drop acid? Can I still do the things I've been doing and be a Christian? And, of course, got some good counseling there at the Clayton House.
I remember the Clayton House and Dick Key. I would, from the Haight-Ashbury, people would come to know Jesus. They had no place to live, and I'd take them up either to Teen Challenge, I think it was up on Van Ness, out by San Francisco General Hospital, or I'd take them up to Clayton House. So I got to mix with the Clayton House. Now remember the living room, Ken.
Yeah.
That was the ministry that Ted Wise, Danny Sands, Jim Dopp, Steve Heathner, Lonnie Frisbee, they operated there. It's on Page Street, just one street right close to the Golden Gate Park. You remember that place?
Yes, Vic. I wasn't there long before we came back down to the Antelope Valley and located in the Way In.
Okay.
House, so
Yeah. Okay, Ken. Wow. So our connections, we connected, but I mean we were in the same places. But I don't think I ever talked to you one time there.
I heard your name a lot.
Okay.
And I knew who you were, but I had never officially met you. So this is a great pleasure for me to finally come face to face with Kent Philpott, who had I don't think people recognize you had such a significant role in the Jesus movement as God called you to the streets there. I mean, how, that was so not typical for a Bible college student, somebody with your background that just want to go down among the hippies of San Francisco.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, I was kind of a bad actor. I didn't have what you had, but I was streetwise. I had 2 felony arrests when I was 15 years old. I was a gangbanger in Los Angeles, so I could handle myself on the street.
Yeah. See, I didn't know that about you.
Okay. Yeah, I've been through my stuff, Ken. I was not as clean as the wind-driven snow by any means.
Yeah.
Yeah. So fill us in a little bit more, Ken, about what happened. You're down there in Lancaster, Way In, and pick up the story from there.
Well, a missionary came to our church from Guatemala. He's a missionary in Guatemala, and he began to share about these incredible miracles that were taking place. Great things were happening there in Palmdale and Lancaster, where kids were getting saved. We went out on the street every day and would share with people. I always made sure I carried my big Bible with me. I asked the pastor if he'd get me a Bible. He got me it said Bible. I said, no, I want a Holy Bible because his said Holy Bible. So we'd walk the streets and we were leading people to Jesus every day. We'd go down into Santa Monica and Hollywood and witness down there, and we had our lives threatened. We just would consider it a great joy to be considered worthy of being persecuted for Christ's sake. I remember we were coming from that tuberculosis, what had previously been the tuberculosis center. We were driving into town and we ran out of gas in an old station wagon that we had. And I just said to the kids that were in the car, I said, let's just pray and believe, because we believed everything. We believed that God could do anything and that we believed in miracles. And so we joined our hands and we prayed, and we were praying, God, fill our tank. God, fill our tank. And an old farmer drove up with a pickup, and he had a big 50-gallon drum barrel on the back. And he hopped out and he said, hey, it looks like you kids ran out of gas. Well, he had no way of knowing. He didn't ask us if we ran out of gas. He popped his nozzle into our tank and he filled it all the way up. And then he just said, that ought to get you into town. And he left. And I said, guys, you realize I turned on the engine and I said, look, it's all the way filled up. We prayed that God would fill our tank. We didn't pray that God would give us some gas, and he filled it all the way up for us. So we were just believing that God, I remember at the Clayton House, we needed the rent, and they were going to remove us if we didn't have the rent by the end of the week. And we started praying fervently in a circle, and we got a knock at the door. We needed like $300 and some change to make the rent. And a knock on the door, and one of the sisters ran to the door and came back with an envelope. And when we opened it, had exactly the amount of money in it that we needed. We ran back to that door to see where that man was. And we looked down the block, in San Francisco, there's no place to disappear. You have to walk either to the corner and turn or get in a car. There were no cars. And I'm not saying he was an angel, but he could have been. And it provided us what we need. We were living like that. But this missionary came and he talked about great miracles that God was doing in Guatemala. And I went up to him after this service and I said, can you take me to this place, Guatemala? I didn't even know where Guatemala was. I said, can you take me there? I want to see the miracles. He said, boy, you got to go to Bible college first. And I said, Bible college? What is a Bible college? And he said, well, ask your pastor. He'll tell you. So I did. I thought this has got to be the place to go. And I went to Bible college and spent a year there, my freshman year. But it wasn't exactly what I thought it was going to be because there weren't any miracles happening there. So I came home to the Antelope Valley, to Lancaster, and started a Bible study with a couple of my friends. By the end of the summer, it was several hundred young people meeting in a Bible study. And we kept having to change location. So I did not go back to Bible college. And as a result, I got drafted into the Army.
Now, I'm going to back up a little, Ken. A little back up. Now, you said that you didn't know if there were angels or not. I think it was. Twice we encountered angels. The first one was the night I met David Hoyt. He took me right to David Hoyt's place, 10 o'clock at night. Took me right there, and he disappeared. Second time I saw it, there was two angels that came, and I won't tell you the stories, but those kinds of things happen. This was an outpouring of the Holy Spirit, but it's typical of awakenings, and it goes on. There's awakenings going on someplace in the world all the time. Special outpouring, and wish we could see another one. But anyway, so I would say, Ken, those were angels. That guy that drove up with that truck and the gas.
Yeah.
And the money, the exact same thing happened to me. I've had it happen exactly like that. Exactly what you wanted. Exactly what you had to have. So now let's go back to Guatemala. So you're did you go down to Guatemala?
No, I didn't at that time because he told me I had to go to Bible college first. I had, just because somebody invited me, I started going to the Foursquare Church that was there in Lancaster.
Yes.
I didn't know I didn't know one church was different than the other. I had no clue about churches and about how they were different. I just know that the church we started going to, a little small church, they loved the Lord with all their hearts, and they welcomed us into their church. They didn't reject us. A lot of druggies and hippies were getting saved, and they warmly welcomed us and loved us, and we were very thankful for that. So we got involved in the Foursquare Church.
Now the church there in Lancaster, the Foursquare, I've been there. I was there with David Hoyt. So, now did you ever get baptized?
I did. I got baptized shortly after getting saved at that Foursquare Church. And I was baptized with Bob Duell, who was the man I mentioned earlier. He had been the largest heroin dealer in, I think, all of that region, and had gotten saved himself. I was baptized with him and some other kids that got saved along with me. And, everything was just such a joy. Went to a Catherine Coleman meeting at the Shrine Auditorium. I couldn't believe that. There was such an incredible presence of God in that place. You know, a lot of people focus on Sister Coleman was different and a little bit strange in so many ways. But boy, does she love Jesus, and the power of God filled that place. And I couldn't almost contain myself with the joy I felt going in there.
I remember Catherine Kuhlman when she was over in Oakland. We would go over, crowds would be there, and she'd, a little bit late, about 5-10 minutes late, she'd walk through the curtains and come out and stand and say, "Have you been waiting for me?"
Yes. You know, she waved her hand, and everybody in the balcony over in that area just fell over. And it was just amazing. We were up in the balcony, and I started to run down. I wanted to go touch her. I felt like I needed to touch her. And I got about halfway down on the bottom floor to where the stage was at Shrine Auditorium, And she said, some of you think you need to touch Catherine Coleman. You don't need to touch Catherine Coleman. You need to touch Jesus. And I just stopped in my tracks in that moment. I thought, that's right. I need to touch Jesus. And I just stopped and turned around and went back up in the balcony. I realized that moment it wasn't people like Catherine Coleman that I needed to touch. It was Jesus that I needed to touch.
Right. Okay. Wow, Ken. So, want to move to, okay, what happened to you there? What happened in down in Lancaster? What was the next thing you did?
Well, I got drafted because I didn't go back to Bible college. And my dean of students at Life Bible College had been a well-known man, Dr. Jack Hayford, who had the Church on the Way in Van Nuys, California.
Right.
He had been our dean of students. So I have this Bible study, and now I'm drafted, and I'm going to be taken into the Army. So I asked Pastor Jack Hayford if he would take that Bible study up there in Lancaster, and he said he felt like he was supposed to do that. So I felt good that the Bible study was going to continue on, and I went in the Army and got sent to Vietnam. And you know something, I really was afraid at first to go to Vietnam, but I realized everything I was experiencing, I needed in my life for what God had for my future. I needed to know God, not just the God of a nice Christian home and the God inside of the four walls of the church, but that wherever you go, no matter how dangerous life gets, that God is there for you. And he was with me. They called me in Vietnam, they called me the Rev. They called me Rev. I'd had 1 year of Bible college, and I prayed with a lot of guys, and I talked with a lot of guys about the Lord, and they just started calling me the Rev. And so that whole experience in Vietnam, I was in ambushes. I was in some really bad situations.
What year?
And every
Ken?
time.
Ken, what year were you in Vietnam? What year?
In 70, 71.
70, 71. Okay.
Would have been 71 because I went in at 670. And yeah, 71 is when I would be actually in Vietnam.
And my youngest brother, Gary, was in Vietnam, combat engineer in 68, 69. And it was David Hoyt that led my brother Gary to Christ.
Oh, my goodness.
My brother Gary. But he suffered enormously. So Vietnam, you were in the Army?
I was in the Army.
What was your rank when you got out?
Actually, they sent me because I scored really high. Apparently, the drugs had not completely taken my brain out. I scored really high on my entrance tests, and they sent me to Fort Benning, Georgia, and made an E5, a sergeant, a squad leader. And that school was designed to train up leaders for Vietnam. And so when you get in that school, you know the next thing is you're going to go to Vietnam.
Well, very good. Well, I was E5 too. I was staff sergeant when I got out of the military during the Vietnam era. All right, Ken, we're going to have to close out. And so this is going to be the end of Why We Are Christians, Part 1 with Ken Hart. And be looking for our second program. So long.